In 1932, an American family could lose electricity, lose access to stores, and still survive an entire winter without outside help. Not because they were wealthy, but because they understood systems modern America slowly forgot. Across the country, families collected rainwater behind barns, preserved vegetables beneath the earth, smoked meat beside wood fires, and saved seeds from year to year without depending on corporations, refrigerated supply chains, or modern infrastructure. Most of that knowledge disappeared within a single generation. Some of it became regulated, some became socially unacceptable, and some simply vanished because convenience made people stop needing it. But during blackouts, supply shortages, and winter storms, many of these forgotten systems still work exactly as they did 100 years ago. This was not survivalism. This was ordinary American life. And for many families, it began with something as simple as rainwater. Long before suburban plumbing spread across America, rural families understood that every storm carried value. Behind barns and beside farmhouses, wooden gutters directed rainwater into barrels, underground cisterns, and hand-built storage tanks that could hold enough water to support a household through long, dry stretches of summer. A single inch of rainfall on a modest farmhouse roof could produce hundreds of gallons of usable water. And farming families understood this long before environmental scientists began talking about drought resilience or water conservation policy. Some households even built primitive filtration systems using simple pipe diversions that separated dirty runoff from cleaner water before it entered storage tanks, while others lined underground cisterns with brick or concrete to protect stored water during hot southern summers when evaporation and contamination became serious concerns. In many farming communities, these systems were not considered unusual or innovative because they were simply part of ordinary American life. In parts of the American West, rainwater collection later became restricted under complicated state water right laws, and Colorado maintained limitations for decades before easing many of them in 2016, after severe drought pressure forced officials to reconsider older policies surrounding residential water collection. But none of this surprised older farming families because they already understood how valuable water became when crops failed, rivers shrank, and wells dried beneath relentless summer heat. Your grandfather did not need scientific studies to understand water conservation. He only needed one dry August. And once water was secured, the next challenge was protecting food through winter. Before refrigeration reached rural America during the 1930s and 40s, survival depended heavily on underground storage. Across Appalachia and the Midwest, families built root cellars beneath farmhouses and hillsides, where the surrounding earth naturally kept potatoes, onions, cabbage, apples, and preserved food cool for months without electricity. But successful storage required knowledge modern households rarely practice anymore because ventilation, humidity, and temperature all had to remain carefully balanced to prevent spoilage through winter. Families learned these lessons through repetition across generations because winter mistakes carried real consequences. And beneath many collapsing barns across rural America, those forgotten rooms still remain quietly underground. But preserving food for winter was only part of survival. Families also had to protect the future itself. Every autumn, farming families collected seeds from the strongest crops before the first frost arrived, because tomatoes, beans, squash, peppers, and corn had to survive into the next planting season without depending on outside suppliers. These were open-pollinated crops slowly adapted to local soil, weather, and insects over generations, and families trusted them because they continued producing reliable harvests year after year. By the late 20th century, large corporations gained increasing control over commercial seed distribution, but that shift also revived interest in heirloom seed preservation, as more Americans began recognizing how fragile centralized food systems could become during shortages and supply disruptions. Seed libraries now exist quietly across the United States, but earlier generations already understood something modern convenience often hides. Food security begins long before the grocery store, and when winter arrived, survival demanded even harder work. By late November, cold weather transformed farms into open-air processing grounds as families gathered beneath clouds of steam and wood smoke, while hogs raised through the year were slaughtered for winter food. Nothing was wasted because ham, bacon, sausage, broth bones, rendered fat, and preserved meat could feed a family for months if processed correctly. But industrial meat production and growing regulations slowly pushed home butchering out of many American communities during the 20th century. Even so, older Americans still remember those winter mornings because food once demanded participation. And inside those kitchens, another forgotten tradition quietly survived for decades. Inside rural kitchens across America, rendered lard remained one of the foundations of everyday cooking because biscuits, cornbread, fried potatoes, and pastries all depended on it long before industrial food companies reshaped American diets. But after Crisco entered the market in 1911, industrial advertising promoted hydrogenated shortening as cleaner and more modern than traditional animal fat. And Americans gradually replaced older cooking fats with industrial alternatives later linked to artificial trans fats and cardiovascular disease. Even so, countless rural kitchens quietly continued cooking the old way. Not because it was fashionable, because it worked. And beyond those kitchens, entire off-grid systems once kept American families alive without depending on modern infrastructure at all. Long before drought restrictions became common across the American West, rural families reused nearly every drop of water that entered the home. Dishwater flowed through simple pipes into backyard gardens where fruit trees, beans, and squash absorbed moisture that would otherwise be wasted. And farming families understood water conservation decades before environmental agencies promoted modern graywater systems. In dry states like Arizona and California, graywater legalization only accelerated after recurring droughts forced officials to recognize how much usable water households were discarding every day. But older farming families already understood that wasting water made no sense because they had survived summers when wells dropped dangerously low and crops failed beneath relentless heat. And while some forgotten systems recycled water, others preserved food itself without electricity at all. Before electric refrigeration spread across rural America after World War II, smokehouses stood behind farms throughout Appalachia, the Ozarks, and the Deep South, where hams, bacon, sausage, and fish hung above slow-burning hardwood fires for days at a time. Cold smoke preserved meat naturally long before refrigerated trucks crossed rural America, and a properly built smokehouse could keep pork edible through winter without electricity. But successful smoking required patience and precision, because temperatures had to remain low while smoke moved slowly through the structure hour after hour. Older generations learned these techniques through repetition because preserving meat was never treated as a hobby. It was survival. Today, most Americans buy factory-packaged meat without ever seeing how preservation once worked. And while smokehouses protected food, another forgotten system protected medicine itself. For most of American history, families treated illness using herbs like elderberry, peppermint, chamomile, and plantain long before pharmacies spread across small-town America. Even after industrial medicine gradually replaced many traditional remedies during the 20th century, isolated farming communities often continued relying on homemade teas and herbal treatments because doctors and hospitals sometimes remained hours away during severe winters and storms. Older generations may not have understood modern chemistry, but they understood which plants helped people recover when healthcare remained distant or unavailable. And while medicine helped families survive illness, preserving food remained equally important once harvest season ended. Before freezers and electric dehydrators existed, American families preserved food using only sunlight, airflow, and patience. Apples, beans, herbs, berries, and strips of salted meat rested on wooden racks beneath late summer skies, while warm air slowly removed moisture because reducing moisture prevented spoilage and allowed food to survive through winter without refrigeration. But successful drying required careful timing and observation because hidden moisture could quietly ruin entire harvests weeks later. Today, much of this knowledge survives only inside homesteading communities and a handful of rural households that never fully abandoned older preservation methods. And while families dried harvests above ground, others stored food beneath the earth itself. Before refrigeration became common, some families built spring houses over naturally cold water sources flowing from hillsides and shallow creeks because flowing spring water naturally carried heat away without electricity or machinery. Milk, butter, cheese, and leftovers remained cool even during summer heat. And in parts of Appalachia, these small stone buildings remained common well into the mid-20th century. But after World War II, electric refrigerators slowly replaced most spring houses throughout rural America, leaving only abandoned stone foundations hidden beside creeks as quiet reminders of a different way of life. And beyond food preservation, many rural families still depended on other forgotten systems of self-reliance that modern America rarely remembers anymore. Long before electric pumps reached rural America, many families survived using hand-dug wells beside farmhouses and barns because iron hand pumps continued working during storms and blackouts without depending on electricity. Properly built wells lined with stone or brick could provide reliable water for generations. And communities like the Amish still preserve many of these older skills today, even as modern regulations increasingly require licensed contractors and drilling permits. Earlier generations trusted labor more than infrastructure because survival often depended on whatever families could build and maintain themselves. And in times of national crisis, some Americans even found ways to power vehicles without gasoline at all. During fuel shortages in World War II, some American vehicles operated using wood gas systems that converted burning wood into combustible fuel for engines. Trucks and farm equipment could continue moving even when gasoline became difficult to obtain, because gasifiers transformed heated wood into flammable gas that engines could burn instead of traditional fuel. The technology became important enough that the Federal Emergency Management Agency later published emergency gasifier blueprints for civilian use. Yet, today, most Americans have never even heard of the system, despite the fact that thousands of wartime vehicles once operated this way. But survival in rural America depended on more than machines and fuel alone. Before pharmacy spread across small-town America, many families relied on home remedies made from elderberries, chamomile, peppermint, and plantain gathered from gardens and nearby fields. Grandmothers brewed teas for fever, treated coughs using dried herbs, and prepared homemade remedies using knowledge passed quietly between generations, long before modern pharmaceutical systems existed. After the Flexner Report reshaped American medicine in 1910, herbal traditions slowly became associated with folklore instead of formal health care. But many rural families continued relying on remedies that had survived for generations because doctors and hospitals often remained hours away. And these quiet household traditions extended far beyond medicine alone. For decades, backyard beehives remained common across rural farms and small American towns because families depended on bees for honey, crop pollination, candle wax, and small amounts of income long before industrial agriculture dominated food production. But modern regulations and concerns surrounding colony collapse disorder caused many small household beekeepers to disappear during the late 20th century, even as interest in local honey and small-scale beekeeping slowly began returning in recent years. In the same way, other small-scale food traditions also survived in limited forms, despite modern regulation. Long before industrial dairy processing became standard, many American families drank milk only hours after it left the cow, because fresh milk often moved directly from barns into farmhouse kitchens the very same morning. Cream slowly rose to the surface inside metal buckets, while children drank milk collected only yards from the house. That changed after growing federal safety regulations and the interstate raw milk ban introduced by the Food and Drug Administration in 1987, yet raw milk debates still continue across America today, as some families legally access unpasteurized dairy products through farm share systems and local loopholes. And beyond food and farming, even ordinary household life once looked completely different. Long before electric dryers became standard in suburban America, wet clothes dried beneath open skies behind nearly every farmhouse because sunlight and moving air cost nothing. Sheets, denim, and work shirts stretched across long clotheslines, while families saved electricity simply by relying on natural systems that earlier generations considered completely normal household life. Today, some neighborhoods still restrict outdoor clotheslines because they are viewed as outdated or unattractive, even though families once depended on them across rural America for generations. And while clothes dried outside, another forgotten system kept food cold through summer heat long before refrigerators arrived: Before refrigerators entered most American homes, large blocks of winter ice were cut from frozen lakes and stored inside insulated ice houses packed with sawdust because thick insulation slowed melting far longer than most people today would expect. Families used the ice through summer to preserve milk, butter, and meat, while entire communities once depended on seasonal ice harvesting before electric refrigeration slowly erased the industry after World War II. But keeping food cold was only one part of surviving winter in rural America. Across rural America, glass jars once filled kitchen shelves after every harvest season because tomatoes, beans, peaches, pickles, and jam had to last through winter without depending on stores. Successful canning required precision, since improper seals or contamination could destroy entire food supplies months later. And earlier generations learned these skills through repetition inside crowded farmhouse kitchens. Today, many younger Americans have never canned food, even once, despite the fact that earlier generations considered food preservation completely ordinary. And at the center of nearly every farmhouse, one object quietly held daily life together. Before central heating spread nationwide, wood stoves stood at the center of American homes because families cooked meals, heated water, dried clothing, and warmed entire rooms using wood gathered by hand during autumn. Old cast iron stoves operated without electricity or distant infrastructure, which is why many still continue functioning during modern blackouts and winter storms, exactly as they did generations ago. Earlier families understood something modern convenience often hides. Heat once depended entirely on preparation, but survival in rural America rarely depended on one household alone. In rural America, survival once depended heavily on neighbors helping neighbors because storms, distance, and isolation could quickly become dangerous. Entire communities gathered to raise barns, repair roofs, harvest crops, and prepare firewood, while families relied less on corporations and more on local cooperation to survive difficult seasons together. And for many Americans, true self-reliance extended far beyond the farm itself. Long before supermarkets existed in every town, many American families survived winter through hunting and trapping because deer, rabbits, muskrats, and trapped fur animals often provided both food and income during the coldest months of the year. Animal pelts could still be traded for flour, salt, and supplies families could not produce themselves, and many rural communities depended heavily on whatever they could hunt, preserve, or gather before winter deepened. Modern licensing systems now regulate many practices earlier generations once considered ordinary survival. But older Americans still remember a time when winter food sometimes depended entirely on what families could bring home from forests and frozen fields with their own hands. And for many families, survival also meant gathering food directly from the land itself. Across forests and river valleys, families once gathered morel mushrooms, wild berries, nuts, and pawpaw fruit directly from the land because knowledge of edible plants passed quietly through generations without books or formal classes. Children learned by walking beside parents and grandparents while memorizing which plants healed, nourished, or poisoned the people gathering them. But as regulations expanded and rural lifestyles slowly disappeared, much of that knowledge faded away with the generations that once depended on it. Many younger Americans today could walk through the same forests their grandparents once used for food and recognize almost nothing growing around them. And once food was gathered, families still needed ways to preserve it through changing seasons. Before refrigeration, fermentation preserved food naturally through bacteria, salt, and thyme, because sauerkraut, sourdough bread, hard cider, homemade vinegar, and small batch alcohol helped families keep food edible through long winters without electricity. But during the 20th century, industrial food production and alcohol regulations slowly pushed many of these household traditions into the background, even though fermentation had once been one of the oldest preservation systems in rural America. But preserving food was only one part of a much larger philosophy. Long before dependence on the electric grid became absolute, many families heated homes with wood stoves, used horses for labor, and powered equipment using windmills or flowing water because self-reliance was simply part of everyday life in isolated rural communities. Fuel, food, water, and tools often depended entirely on whatever families could repair, preserve, grow, or build themselves without outside assistance. Because beneath all of these forgotten systems was a mindset modern America rarely teaches anymore. Older Americans rarely viewed self-sufficiency as survivalism because planting gardens, repairing tools, preserving food, and solving problems were treated as ordinary parts of adulthood rather than hobbies or emergency preparation. Modern systems brought enormous convenience and safer living conditions, but they also created a level of dependence earlier generations would barely recognize. The knowledge never completely disappeared. It only became quiet. This is not about romanticizing the past. Electricity, refrigeration, modern medicine, and industrial infrastructure improved millions of lives across America and changed the country in ways earlier generations could barely imagine. But some of the older knowledge still matters because many of those systems continue working even when modern infrastructure fails. During blackouts, supply shortages, fuel disruptions, and winter storms, some families still return to skills their grandparents once considered completely ordinary because older generations understood something modern America slowly forgot. Self-reliance was never about fear, it was about resilience. And somewhere across rural America, there are still families using some of these forgotten systems exactly as earlier generations once did. So, before this knowledge disappears entirely, maybe ask your grandparents which of these skills they still remember. And maybe ask yourself which one you would want to learn first.